Have you ever wondered what happens underground in big cities? Climb 20 to 30 meters up, and life will be in full swing there. Day will give way to night. Maybe even thousands of people will go about their business. But down there, it is always night, inhabited only by mechanisms and rats. This is exactly how I would have started writing a book if this idea had not left me a long time ago, when I got this job, temporarily. 10 years later, there is no hope of changing it. And every time I think I have gotten used to it, I realize and understand that it is impossible to get used to. I work at a research institute located outside the Moscow Ring Road. Our institution is a secure one. This means it is secret. From the street, or rather, from the vacant lot where it is located, the research institute looks like a small 5-story building, strongly reminiscent of a school. The construction is still Soviet, and therefore, I would not be surprised if this was really a model school project to divert attention and save labor. However, the top 5 floors are the tip of the iceberg. In fact, there are 2 more lower ones, which are much larger than the building above. This is where all of the equipment is located and the laboratories are located. Only 3 floors above are operational, and the top 2 are almost never used, and therefore are filled with scrap, and sometimes things that aren't scrap, just pure rubbish. I don't think that after everything I'm about to tell you, it would be wise to mention anything about the activities of the Research Institute itself, since by recording and posting all this on the network, I am already exposing myself, so there won't be any details about the laboratories below. However, I work even lower than that. The fact is that below the 2 underground floors, there is a basement with communications that stretch far into Moscow and even connect to the metro, and my job is to keep an eye on them. When I responded to the job offer, I was even surprised. A person with a higher education was required to play the role of an electrician, plumber, and watchman all rolled into one, but they paid a very substantial amount, and were even ready to hire a person without experience. Of course, I agreed. I directly saw a life full of freebies for the next however many years, but when I first went down to the basements, I realized what the catch was. The communications laid back in Soviet times did not have any light sources, and on the day of the round, which happened once a month, one had to go to the connection point with the metro and return back. I had to walk almost all day, and I wasn't supposed to have a partner down there. I was also strictly forbidden to print exits to the metro and other city communications, and this, in fact, meant that I had to leave and enter in the exact same place. I was given the simplest equipment: 1 helmet with a flashlight, 1 handheld flashlight, a small backpack for tools, a walkie-talkie, and a shocker. The latter was intended in case I was in danger in the tunnel, and the instructions told me that if any unauthorized persons were detected in the tunnels, I should immediately turn off the light on my helmet, report the intruders on the radio, and go back. In other words, if diggers, homeless people, punks, etc. somehow get into the tunnels, it is not my job to get them out of there, which was a huge relief to me. The instructions told me to inspect communications in the form of huge wires. It is not clear what they are needed for. I then had to report any breakdown by radio, and then begin repairs, or call a team. However, calling the brigade, as I later found out, was strongly disapproved of by the authorities. It was the same with the pipes, but in this case, calling a brigade was necessary. There were also strange things in the instructions that immediately attracted my attention, but if I asked any questions about them, I was threatened with a reprimand. This was because the Research Institute itself, like everything that is in it, let me remind you, is a secret object. One of the strange instructions ordered was never to close the gates to the blind passages closer to the metro. Another said that in the event of, I quote, strong signal blocking interference in radio communication devices, it was necessary to stop going around and go back. If at the same time, I had already covered more than half the distance, then I had to stay in place and wait for help. There were many similar rules to this, but these 2 instructions seemed strange to me from the very beginning. Next, I will describe several of my hikes, which forced me to repeatedly try to change jobs while doubting my mental health. I remember the first time especially well. I was briefly introduced to the place of work. The stairs descended into a small, very shabby and dusty room. There was a lonely chair in this room. To the left was an elevator shaft sealed with brick. This was strange, since there was no elevator in there at all. At the right end of the room, there was a small, narrow corridor that led to a huge canal through which pipes were laid. The pipes were of enormous size, and they were laid below the entrance to the canal, and on top of the pipes, there was a metal walkway, a crossing bridge like those that are under the roof in shopping centers. The pipes ran along the canal for another 50 meters, after which they ran into a bunker with a heavy iron door, over which a construction lamp was always burning. It was the only source of light in the canal. To the left of the bunker, there was another heavy iron door. Behind this was my workplace. It looked like an ordinary guard's closet. There were monitors that displayed data from pressure and voltage sensors in the tunnel. There were also a couple of cameras located in key places, a bed, a couple of medium-sized iron boxes, and one large one. With the exception of the huge iron door, the musty smell, and the lack of windows, it was a fairly cozy place. Directly opposite the closet, or on the right side of the bunker, there was an entrance to the tunnels. There was no door on it, and the same metal path, separated from the main one, went into it. Also, right opposite the entrance to this canal, there was a huge door, still leading to the same tunnels, but it did not open. Its dimensions were so large, you could pull a tank through it, and why such a huge door was needed, I still do not understand. I also met the operator, who was sitting at the checkpoint and who was on duty on the communication line with my walkie-talkie. He was not very old, but already had graying hair with a funny grey mustache. We exchanged a few words, and during the conversation, he looked at me somewhat sadly. This alarmed me. I spent the next 2 days in the closet, watching the instrument readings through my fingers. But on the third day, one of the screens began to go crazy. This is how my first trip began. The screen showed that there was an unusually high load on one of the lines. I immediately turned on the radio. Checkpoint, can you hear me? I hear you well, over. I have a load of 120 on line XXXX. Do you receive? Short circuit load on line XXXX 350, receiving. I didn't understand you. Is everything okay? Listen, Soyoza. Vadim Ilich, the checkpoint duty officer whom we had met earlier, suddenly broke the formal style of communication. You will have to go there now and check what is wrong. Here is my advice to you. Wait until the load disappears, then go ahead. I understand, checkpoint. I finished the conversation. The load disappeared after an hour, and for the first time, I was ready to walk deep into the tunnel. I must say that I was in high spirits for 2 reasons. 1, I became very bored sitting around for the third day doing nothing, and I was finally ready to get to the main job. I put the backpack on my back and put my helmet on, flipping the flashlight switch. Leaving the closet and closing the door behind me, I reported this to the checkpoint. The duty officer confirmed my departure, and I approached the tunnel. The flashlight illuminated into the darkness, but only the walls became visible. There was dense blackness ahead. For the first time, I stood there alone, without people, outside the closet. Something was buzzing somewhere far away, but the silence still squeaked in my ears. It was quiet enough that I could hear myself breathing, and the blackness of the tunnel no longer seemed so interesting to me. Something in me screamed loudly for a second and began to fill my brain with thoughts that it would be nice to just say screw it and give up work. At the same time, I wanted to turn my back to the tunnel even less than to go into it. In the end, I pulled myself together and decided to continue on my way. After a couple of 100 meters, the iron bridge ended, and I was already walking through the dust, breathing the terribly stinking air of dampness and dust. I had to cover my face with my sleeve so as not to cough every couple of meters, but after a couple of minutes, my body got used to the abuse and stopped reacting so sharply. In short, I got to the point of failure, and everything was really bad there. Several wires were chewed, and, it seems, there were teeth marks, like human teeth, but much sharper. Moreover, only the insulation was chewed into trash, but the cores were not touched. I reported everything on the radio, asked to turn off the power to the line, to which I heard the answer that we had to wait. I took off my backpack, sat on it, and lit a cigarette. They cut it off after 10 minutes. I wrapped the wiring in a couple of layers, and, while I was doing this, I noticed a lump of strange mucus near the wall, more like some kind of strange mushroom. Having finished wrapping the wiring, I touched it a little with my foot, and suddenly, about 300 meters away, I heard a heavy bang, as if an old bag had fallen to the ground. Something told me that I needed to run, and quickly, which I did. I left my backpack with all of my belongings there. I was exhausted while still in the tunnel, and barely made it to the closet, where I realized that my backpack was lost. I reported to the checkpoint. The next day, the authorities scolded me strongly and threatened me with a reprimand, but after an explanation, they gave up very quickly. And then I remembered what Illich told me about the load. Everything in my head started to click into place. What would I say if I went right away? The next 3 trips were simple. Nothing special happened in them. I even began to forget the first trip, and the salary I received 3 times already helped a lot with this. And so again, as in most working hours, I sat in the closet, looked at the monitors, and played ancient shooting games. Access to the internet from the Research Institute building is prohibited. Mobile phones are also prohibited, and therefore, in order to not be bored while sitting, I pumped up imperishables to match the local computer. Here, I also need to say that according to the instructions, again, the door to the closet should always be closed. It does not matter whether I am inside or outside, and Illich hinted more than once that it was worth following this instruction. And here I am, sitting, finishing off the last enemy monsters, and suddenly I notice that something does not quite fit. I paused the game, and indeed, one of the sounds remained. I began listening, and the sound seemed to be coming from behind the wall, such a quiet tapping. At the same time, the source in the wall was constantly moving, as if it was crawling inside. I don't know what kind of demon confused me then, but I knocked on the wall in response, and that is where everything began. The knocking suddenly began to increase in volume, and at the same time move along the wall towards the door, 1 blow at a time. The last few blows were so strong that crumbs fell from the ceiling and the light bulbs in the ceiling began to flicker. I, very frightened by all this, grabbed a shocker from the table and hid in a corner. But after the last blow, everything suddenly died down. For a couple of seconds, I still sat, hugging the shocker with my heart racing. It took me a while to come to my senses, but as soon as I decided to get up, I heard footsteps. Or rather, I didn't so much hear as I felt. The floor was vibrating weakly, as if something heavy was moving through the pipes, and, judging by the sounds, it stopped approximately next to the door. I had to urgently report to the checkpoint, but I was afraid to even move, let alone speak. And suddenly, they started scratching at the door. They were scratching somewhere very low, but the sound was as if a whole bunch of claws was scraping at the same time. Then the sound stopped for a second, and something hit the door very hard. The blow was so powerful that one of the light bulbs in the closet went out, and a whole piece of plaster fell off the ceiling. At this point, panic took over. I grabbed the walkie-talkie and started talking completely incoherent crap into it, begging them to understand what was happening. Meanwhile, the door slammed open a couple more times, and after that there was silence. After another 10 minutes, the door was opened from the other side, and a very crazy police squad and a stern, gloomy Illich came in, who was the only one out of all of us who remained calm. When examining the door, at its lower part, they found a whole pile of dead rats. Judging by the bloody warm paws and a pair of claws stuck in the stone next to the door, they really wanted to get to the other side of the door, and there was also a small dent on the door, but the door was solid iron and about as thick as a door to a safe. Whatever made that dent must have been absolutely huge. They did not find anything else, and after this incident, I decided to look for a new job while still working here. I really did not want to go back into the tunnels after such an incident. Illich was silent, like a dead man, and no matter how much I tried to get something out of him, he said nothing at all, except that there was nothing on the camera, which means, most likely, there was a collapse. How the hell do you have a collapse in an artificially dug tunnel, especially to hit the door vertically and with no trace of any kind of debris? It made no sense at all, but that is what they wrote in all of the documents. After that, I decided to study the recordings from all the cameras, but, as luck would have it, there was absolutely nothing on the cameras. Needless to say, I still have not found a better job. The 4th trip was on schedule, and I went into the tunnel, this time holding tighter to the shocker. On my 2nd trip, I bought myself a construction respirator to make it easier to breathe in all this dust, and therefore I calmly walked forward, not stopping every 100 meters to catch my breath and clear my throat. I got very close to the metro connection when one of the blind passages caught my eye. A light breeze blew from it, but it chilled me to the bones. This was clearly not normal, and I reported it to the checkpoint. It would be better if I didn't do this, because from there, they immediately ordered me to go and check for open exits. I was forced to go, and I reluctantly went. The further I walked, the stronger the wind was, and the colder it became. When my hands openly began to tremble, I began to hear something like a whisper in the howling wind, and the further I walked, the less I heard the wind, and the louder the whisper became. There were a lot of voices, and they all whispered something very intrusively, but I was so cold that I didn't think much about it. Towards the end, the passage turned a corner, and I noticed that near this turn, the entire passage was painted with strange sticks and markings. I could lie and say that they were strange runes or symbols, but I clearly just saw a bunch of markings drawn with whatever. Chalk, dirt, something dark brown, or just scratched on the walls and wire insulation. When I had already completely approached the turn, my helmet light suddenly went out, and at the same time, I felt eyes on me. By this moment, I was already completely chilled. With stiff fingers, I reached for the flashlight on my belt and turning it on, pointed it straight in front of me. In the light of the lantern I saw something. I don't know how to describe it. Small, black holes instead of eyes, more like nostrils. A round head, without a mouth, without any features, just folds of skin. It looked at me, without taking its eyes off me, and I felt enormous weakness throughout my whole body. It became increasingly colder, and I just wanted to lie down and sleep. My brain has already imagined me lying down on the floor of the tunnel, tucking my legs in and trying to warm up, falling into sleep, and this creature comes up to me while I'm sleeping and begins to devour me. This thought exuded both horror and almost homeliness. Perhaps it would have ended like this, but I was saved by the fact that the walkie-talkie suddenly clicked and Illich's voice was heard. "Post, where did you go? Have you found the source of the wind?" The flashlight blinked, and for a moment the creature appeared right in front of my face and then disappeared just as quickly as it appeared. Both lanterns lit up as if nothing had happened, and the wind suddenly disappeared. I put out the handheld flashlight, tucked it into my belt, and, still staring into space, took out the walkie-talkie. My voice sounded as if it belonged to a completely different person. "Checkpoint, the wind has stopped. I did not find the source, okay?" After that, I leaned on the tunnel wall and lit a cigarette to warm myself up. I was shaking, and the scene of me falling asleep played over and over in my head. After finishing my cigarette, I decided to walk to the turn to make sure that the danger had passed and I could safely turn back. The lantern picked out a dead end, already completely scrawled with dashes. In the middle there was a circle drawn with chalk, in which a dried human corpse lay in a fetal position. There wasn't even the smell of death or rotting. I was shaking again, but now I was also very nauseous. That's what could have happened to me if it weren't for the walkie-talkie. I almost died. This time it was not a knock on the door, not strange sounds. No, it was a real danger to my life, and I was not imagining it. I could not stop. I felt nauseous and shaking. Completely exhausted, I moved away from the corner so as to not see this body, and again took out the walkie-talkie. "Checkpoint, there is a dead body here. Call the police, over." "We'll call them right now." "Tsuyosa, most importantly, come back quickly, over." That was only the second time Illich called me by name. I returned back as if I was in a trance. The creature was visible everywhere in the shadows, and I stubbornly tried not to look back. I reached the closet, abruptly closed the door, and fell weakly onto the bed. I dreamed that I was walking through a tunnel and heard a slurping sound behind me, but I was afraid that they would turn around. Or did I really hear the slurping sound when I walked back? I don't remember this part very well. In any case, Illich woke me up. There were no police, but there were military men constantly casting sidelong glances at me. There were an unusually large number of them. Illich sat down next to me on the bed. He smelled strongly of fumes. "It was Yura. He worked here before you. When I heard about the corpse from you, I immediately understood that Yura had been found. I wanted to curse him, both his name and our general superiors. I told him plainly. I quit. No, Suryoza, you are not resigning. You don't quit here. You won't find another job now, even if you hurt yourself. I didn't even doubt his words. I just got up and went home to sleep. The next day I was called to the bosses and given a substantial bonus. I was also given a week off to recover from the shock. Needless to say, I spent the entire week drinking away this bonus at the club, but I returned to work, not at all rested. Now almost every night, I had a dream about how I fell asleep in that tunnel. That day, in the morning, I felt that the day would be bad. I did not feel like going to work at all. Although the day of the round had not yet arrived, my fears were confirmed when I arrived. The monitor displayed a strong drop in pressure in the pipes located at the end of the tunnel near the metro. I contacted the checkpoint and was told to go there. As usual, I gathered myself and plunged into the darkness of the tunnels again. About halfway to the end of the tunnel, I began to hear rustling somewhere above me, and this made me quicken my pace, but the rustling did not lag behind. It rustled as if someone was pushing paper through the pipes and running along the edges of the tunnel with a long pole. A rat running out in front of me made me jump up on the spot, and my twitching flashlight snatched a strange shadow from the darkness of the tunnel. I put my hand on the shocker, and the last meeting in the blind passage was spinning in my head again. I continued on my way, and suddenly realized that something was scurrying around in the tunnel right above me. Trying not to look up, I tried to convince myself that they were just rats, and continued to move forward. Fortunately, the rustling noises quickly began to subside, and I calmed down a little. Having reached the desired pipe, I began to inspect it, periodically looking nervously into the dark emptiness of the tunnel. The pipe had already been obligingly blocked, but many things about it seemed strange to me. Firstly, given the size of the pipe, there should have been a huge puddle where I am standing now, but there wasn't. Instead, there was only a small puddle, which most likely dripped after the water was turned off. Secondly, a fairly large section of the pipe was covered with small triangular holes, along the edges of which the metal seemed to have been bitten through. Realizing that I clearly could not handle this on my own, I informed them on the radio of the size of the required pipe and asked for them to send a team. Illich replied that I would have to wait for the brigade on the spot. Once again cursing this work to myself, I asked him not to delay with the brigade and arranged a small halt for myself. I opened the canned food, took out a bottle of water, and decided to have a little snack. I placed the lantern specifically so that it shined into the tunnel and so I could see anything coming at all. I waited for about 2 hours, but the brigade never showed up. By this time, I had already managed to feel more or less safe and once again contacted the checkpoint, asking where the brigade was. A slightly agitated Illich answered me, saying that there had been no contact with the brigade for an hour and that I should return. I remembered the crawling in the tunnel that I had seen earlier, and I felt an unpleasant feeling in the pit of my stomach. Having collected the remains of my halt, I walked back at a fairly fast pace. I did not encounter any rustling or other strange things on the way back, but that did not make it any easier. And so, halfway, in approximately the same place where I heard the rustling sounds, I think I found the brigade. This spectacle was not for the faint of heart. On pieces of pipe that came from nowhere, stuck into the ground in a random order, there were pieces of meat strung together, literally chewed beyond recognition, with scraps of skin and intestines stretching between them. At the same time, there was not a drop of blood anywhere, and I stood rooted to the spot, looking at all of this. The stench was terrible, and I again felt the urge to vomit right there, after which I rushed out of there as quickly as I could. And what finished me off was that a piece of lung strung on one of the pipes twitched as I ran past it. This time, fear clouded my mind so much that I ran without looking back, and almost didn't notice how, very close to the exit from the tunnel, my lantern illuminated out of the darkness a tall dark figure with very unpleasant proportions. I did not have time to figure out what was happening, and I ran straight through it, straight past it. My face and the entire exposed part of my skin seemed to be doused with boiling water as I ran past. I involuntarily screamed and started running even faster, feeling the blisters swelling on my hands. Right at the entrance to the tunnel, all I had time to do was press a button on the radio and shout something into it, after which I lost consciousness. I woke up in the hospital, and it turned out that I had slept for 12 hours straight, but it seemed to me that just a second ago I had run out of the tunnel. Now I am in the burn department. The doctors say that my eyes miraculously survived. Illich came and brought a letter from the authorities. It contained another order for a bonus, as well as instructions under no circumstances to share with the hospital medical staff the circumstances of how the injuries were sustained. Illich stayed with me for a little while and said that I was the first person to survive at this job for so long, and that they were probably watching over me from above. But personally, it seems to me that they are looking after me from a completely different place. And that's all I have. I'm still at the job now, but nothing seems to have changed so far.